Chapter 13, Integrative Physiology 1, Control of Body Movements. In this chapter, we'll talk about neural, autonomic, and skeletal muscle reflexes, and we'll discuss proprioceptors. So there are different ways we can classify our neural reflexes. We can classify them based on their efferent division. For example, we have somatic reflexes, and these would involve the neurons, the somatic motor neurons that control our skeletal muscles. Then we have autonomic reflexes. These would involve our autonomic efferent neurons that control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, adipose tissue, etc. We can also classify them based on where they are integrated. So if the reflex goes into the spinal cord and goes right back out, then it's a spinal reflex. If the reflex goes up to the brain and then goes back out, then it's a cranial reflex. We can also determine or define it based on time at which the reflex is developed. So if you are born with it, it is an innate reflex. If it is something that you learned through experience, it is a learned reflex. And then finally, we can determine the type of reflex by looking at the number of neurons involved and looking at the number of synapses. So a synapse would be between two neurons. That's our synapse. So we count how many neurons do we have and how many synapses do we have, really. So if only one synapse is involved, so we have a sensory neuron coming in and then a motor neuron going out, that would be a monosynaptic reflex because there's only one synapse between that sensory and motor neuron, or the efferent neuron. The other types of reflexes where there are multiple neurons involved, you'll have more than one synapse, and so we will call those polysynaptic. So let's take a look at some examples. So here's our first example. We have a stimulus that activated a receptor, and then the sensory neuron is bringing that information into the spinal cord. Then the sensory neuron is synapsing onto a somatic motor neuron, which is going right back out, so that's our efferent fiber, and stimulating our skeletal muscle. So we could classify this as a somatic reflex because it involves our somatic motor neuron in the efferent division. We can also call this a spinal reflex because it's integrated in the spinal cord. The brain isn't involved. We could also call this a monosynaptic reflex because there's only one synapse between two neurons. So this is a monosynaptic monosynaptic somatic spinal reflex, or a spinal reflex. You can use all combinations essentially. Okay. In this example, we have a sensory neuron coming in. It is synapsing onto an interneuron. Remember, an interneuron is a neuron that's completely within the central nervous system between two neurons. And then that interneuron is then synapsing onto our efferent neuron, in this case, another somatic motor neuron. And we know it's a somatic motor because it's going to our skeletal muscle fiber here. And so this is also a spinal reflex. It is also a somatic motor reflex, but there are 2 synapses, so it is a polysynaptic reflex. So it's just different ways that we can categorize our reflexes. In this example, we have a stimuli activating a receptor, and the sensory neuron is bringing that information into the spinal cord. It is synapsing onto an inner neuron, which is synapsing onto the efferent division. And in this case, we have a preganglionic neuron synapsing then onto a postganglionic neuron, and finally we get to our target cell. So this is an autonomic reflex because it's not going to skeletal muscle fibers, so it's going to something else other than skeletal muscle, so it's going to be autonomic. It is also a spinal reflex, and in this case there are 1, 2, 3 synapses, so this is a polysynaptic reflex. Now let's imagine we took away this inner neuron. We have the sensory neuron bringing the information in, and let's say it directly synapses onto the efferent division. Now, all autonomic efferent divisions include a pre- and a postganglionic neuron. So that means the minimum number of synapses that you can have is 3 in an autonomic reflex. So all autonomic reflexes are polysynaptic. You will never find a monosynaptic autonomic reflex. Okay, so let's move on to our proprioceptors. So proprioceptors tell us about our body position in space. And there are different types of proprioceptors. We have muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors. So joint receptors are found in capsules and ligaments around your joints and tell information about what's going on there. Well, that's not your joint, but around your joints. Then we have our Golgi tendon organs, which are shown here. and they respond to muscle tension that's developed during isometric contractions, and they tell information again about our body position. The one that I want to really focus on, though, is our muscle spindle. So our muscle spindles are stretch receptors that send information about muscle length. So let's take a look at our muscle here. So this is our skeletal muscle. It's our normal muscle that we think of, and we're going to call these guys our extrafusal muscle fibers. And they are innervated by our somatic motor neuron, but specifically these are going to be your alpha motor neurons. So you can also call these alpha somatic motor neurons. Now, if we were to tease in between our muscle spindles, we're going to open up, we're going to tease between our muscle fibers. We're going to open it up. This is what we see. So here's one of our muscle fibers. Here's another. Again, these would be called your extrafusal fibers. Just think of it as another name. If we were to pull them aside, inside, you'll find your muscle spindles. Now, muscle spindles have their own skeletal muscle fibers that's specifically associated with them. And we are going to call these guys our intrafusal fibers. So they're our intrafusal. So the extrafusal fibers and intrafusal fibers are all skeletal muscle fibers. But the intrafusals are specifically associated with muscle spindles. And these muscle fibers are innervated by our gamma motor neurons. So these are also somatic motor, but specifically they are the gamma motor neurons. So the alpha motor neurons, to reiterate, innervate our extrafusal fibers, and our gamma motor neurons innervate our intrafusal fibers. And the gamma motor neuron and the intrafusal fibers are associated with our muscle spindles. Okay, so what do? Well, muscle spindles help monitor muscle length. It tells us what our muscle tension is, and it also really helps prevent our muscles from being overstretched. So our muscle spindles are tonically kind of activating our extrafusal fibers. So our extrafusal fibers maintain a certain level of tension even though we're at rest. So now let's say we start to stretch our skeletal muscle too far. Then our muscle spindles will recognize that, and it will initiate a contraction of our extrafusal fibers. So it's a way essentially to prevent our muscles from being overstretched. Okay, now let's look at reflexes, and we're going to look at a very simple reflex that you may all be familiar with. That's our patellar tendon reflex, or the knee jerk reflex. So this is when you go to the doctors, or you can do this at home, just tap your patellar tendon and your leg shoots up, it extends. And so this is a very simple monosynaptic reflex. So here is the hammer tapping the tendon. It's going to stretch the tendon here, and so your muscles will respond appropriately. So the sensory neurons will send that stretch information into the spinal cord, and it will stimulate our quadriceps, our extensors, and it will inhibit our hamstrings, our flexors. And that way, because these are antagonistic muscle groups, we will extend our leg. So this is just a simple monosynaptic stretch reflex. It is also a spinal reflex, so the brain isn't involved in this process, and you can all try this at home. Another reflex that's shown here is slightly more complex, but it's not too complicated. It's a flexion reflex. So in this case, your leg will flex as opposed to extend, and then you will also cross to the other side and extend the other side. So we call this a flexion reflex and a crossed extensor reflex. So let's say you're walking and you accidentally step on a tack. Well, that's painful. So you're going to activate nociceptors, our pain receptors. The pain receptors are going to send that information into the spinal cord through our pain fibers, and it's going to do several things, actually. It's going to cause the side that we stepped on the tack, we want to lift that leg up, obviously. So we are going to then flex our leg. So in this case, it's going to stimulate our flexors and inhibit the extensors. And if we were to lift up this leg without making adjustments on the other side, we'll fall over. So we actually have to then cross to the other side of the spinal cord to extend the other leg so that it can deal with the extra weight that you're putting on it. And in addition, we're going to send that pain signal up to the brain so that we're aware of the pain. So more complex reflex here. It's still a spinal reflex because the brain isn't involved in the response, but obviously this is polysynaptic. And one disease that's related to loss of motor control is Parkinson's disease. This is a progressive neural disorder, so it's a neurodegenerative disorder, meaning, and it's progressive, so it's going to continue to degenerate. And it's characterized by abnormal movements, speech difficulties. You can also have cognitive changes. And it results from a loss of dopaminergic neurons in the basal ganglia. So, neurons that secrete the neurotransmitter dopamine in the basal ganglia start to essentially degenerate. So, you lose these neurons. And so, you're basically going to have a loss of dopamine in the basal ganglia. So, how do we treat Parkinson's? There's no cure, but if the issue arises because you're losing dopamine releasing neurons, then one way is to administer dopamine. The only issue is dopamine can't cross the blood brain barrier, but the good news is a precursor to dopamine, L-DOPA, can cross. So, L-DOPA is given, and then once it crosses the blood brain barrier, it gets converted into dopamine. And it's still kind of the best way to treat Parkinson's. And that's it for this chapter. Thank you.